The NBA draft starts next Wednesday, and if his agent is to be believed, there is quite a bit of interest in point guard Bronny James.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Thursday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and you are joining at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, January through December, not just during the season. We are here with you 5 days a week, all off season long. Folks, I want to thank you those of you who are everyday listeners who are checking out the show every single day, and those of you who have joined us on our Discord channel. There's a link in the show notes on both audio and video platforms. If you haven't done so yet, come hang out. We're talking college hoops 24/7. Today is an NBA draft focused episode of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're talking Bronny James in the first segment and some quotes from Rich Paul, his agent, also the agent for his father, LeBron James, what it all might mean. And then we're going to talk about a pair of draft sleepers, two undersized point guards in the second segment, and a pair of mid-major bigs in the third and final segment. Guys that I think might be getting overlooked a little bit by NBA scouts, maybe some overthinking about some of their flaws as opposed to just looking at the success that those players have had. So we'll get to that to close out the show, but want to start with the latest on Bronny James. Because there has, I don't want to say never, but rarely been a player who has dominated the pre-draft narrative as much as Bronny, who wasn't a top 5 pick or even a lottery pick. Sometimes players dominate the pre-draft conversation and they end up going in the barely top 10, even barely in the lottery range, but rarely does a player command this much attention, this much conversation, this much hate and love and just discourse than Bronny James. And he's not a player who's going to go in the lottery. There's some who believe he might go in the first round. We're going to talk about that momentarily, but there's also many who believe he will not get drafted and many more who believe he should not get drafted. And all of this is, of course, because of his bloodlines, because he is the son of NBA superstar, future Hall of Famer, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time in LeBron James. And because at one point, a while ago, LeBron James indicated that he wanted to play with his son, Bronny, at the next level and made it seem like he was willing to sign with whatever team drafted or signed Bronny out of his first year at USC. To be clear, that statement has been refuted multiple times. Rich Paul, we're going to talk a lot about what he said in a recent conversation with ESPN on today's show. But one of the things that he reiterated in this conversation and has said multiple times is that is no longer a focal point for LeBron or Bronny. It was never a focal point for Bronny. Bronny never said he wants to go to the NBA to play with his dad. You could argue that him choosing to go to the NBA after one mediocre as a polite way to put it, season at USC is an indication that he does want to play with his dad, but also who wouldn't want to go play with their dad? Like, I don't blame him for that, but he has never publicly said that. LeBron has walked back his previous comments saying that he's happy to play with or against his son. He wants the best for him. He's not focused on playing with Bronny as a primary driver of his impending free agency. That narrative, the narrative that he wants to play with his son, is still thriving. It's still out there, despite the fact that it has been refuted by Rich Paul, by LeBron himself, and by Bronny, who has said he is focused primarily on just getting into the league. But part of the reason that this conversation still exists is that Bronny's only worked out with 2 teams. For a player that is primarily projected as a second round to undrafted pick, those guys tend to work out with a bunch of teams. They work out with everybody. Rich Paul has indicated, the 2 teams, by the way, are the Los Angeles Lakers, of course, where LeBron is currently playing, and the Phoenix Suns, who do desperately need some help at the point guard position, although their interest in Bronny is, people have some skepticism about it. Let's put it that way. But this is not the first time Rich Paul has done this, and he said this in his conversation with ESPN was a little combative. Like, I think he was kind of trying to refute a lot of the notions that he's shielding Bronny, or that that they're only willing to play for a certain number of teams. He's coming out and saying, I am doing what's best for my client. I would do this for any client. If Bronny James's name was something completely different, this is how I would treat it. I only want to put him with teams that are successful. I don't care where he gets picked. I care that he ends up at the right fit. And there's some truth to this. Rich Paul represented Chris Livingston as a good example, went 58th in the draft last year to the Milwaukee Bucks, probably would have gone higher, but they didn't have him do a lot of workouts, and they kind of picked and chose where they wanted him to work out and who they wanted to kind of put him in front of, because they wanted him to find a better landing spot. Whether Milwaukee was I believe Milwaukee was the spot that they wanted him. He ends up there. So maybe Rich Paul isn't blowing too much smoke, but there's still some intrigue here. Rich Paul, again, Phoenix and LA are the only two teams that have worked him out. Rich Paul indicated that LeBron is not going to sign a minimum contract with the Phoenix Suns. He made that very clear. I think it's safe to assume that LeBron James is not going to sign a minimum contract with anybody, because he has said this isn't the driving factor for him. So I think we can assume that, just draft Bronny and you'll get LeBron for a cheap contract. That's not a reality. Would it be absolutely terrifying if LeBron teamed up with a team that has Kevin Durant and Devin Booker and Bradley Beal? Yeah, I'm not sure if it works with that many ball dominant players, and I'm not sure Bronny's the point guard you want on that team. But hey, if they think it'll work, they should give it a shot. But again, Rich Paul has confirmed that's not likely. He also said that if the Lakers drafting Bronny was a guarantee that LeBron would re-sign with the Lakers, Rich Paul's direct quote was him saying, I would make the Lakers take Bronny at 17. They have picks 17 and 55, which is wild. It's crazy that we're in an era where Rich Paul's coming out and directly saying, if LeBron guaranteed he'd re-sign with the Lakers, I would force that team to draft a player who averaged less than 5 points per game on inefficient shooting at 17 overall. Some people might chuckle at the fact that the Lakers' most recent first-round draft pick, Jalen Hood-Schifino, really struggled in his rookie season. And it's like, well, is it going to get worse? Bronny is not as good of a prospect as Jalen Hood-Schifino. That doesn't mean he won't become a better NBA player. That happens. It is certainly in the realm of possibilities. And I don't want to sit here and be somebody who bashes on Bronny, because there's enough people who are bashing on Bronny. It is fair to say that his freshman season at USC was not the typical performance you would see from a player who goes one and done. There's no debate about that. Less than 5 points a game, shot 36% from the field, shot 26% from three. Now, he missed the start of the season because he was still recovering from that cardiac arrest. And I think a lot of people gloss over that more than they should. That is a significant thing that happened, a huge medical issue. And while he was cleared to return and was ostensibly fully healthy, I think it's fair to assume that it impacted him to some degree. But again, that doesn't mean that you assume, he's much better than he was at USC, so I'm going to draft him in the first round. But Rich Paul is indicating that there are teams who have not worked out Bronny, teams that are not the Lakers and the Suns, who are interested in him. He mentioned 3 teams specifically in this article at ESPN. He mentioned the Minnesota Timberwolves saying, quote, Minnesota would love to get Bronny in, but I don't know who their owner is going to be. So he's straight up admitting the Timberwolves want to work him out, but I'm not letting Bronny work out with them because I don't know the direction that the franchise is going outside of this. Minnesota feels like a really good fit, by the way. They're a winning team. They're a veteran team. They have a high-level guard already on the roster. They have a veteran point guard in Mike Conley. Like, that feels like a really good spot. But Rich Paul and the agency are saying, no go. That's not where we want him, so we're not even pushing it. Dallas Mavericks, again, this is what Rich Paul said. He said, Nico Harrison, the Mavericks GM, is like an uncle to Bronny. If the Lakers didn't take him at 55, Dallas would take him at 58 and give him a guaranteed deal. Is it true? I have no idea. Our fantastic Locked On Mavericks host, Nick Angstand, did a whole episode short just recently about the reported interest between Bronny and the Mavericks. He talked about it. He talked about his thoughts on it. Definitely check it out if you haven't yet. It's excellent. I don't think Nick having to whiplash from going from covering the NBA Finals to talking about Bronny James, probably a bit of a rough stretch for him, but it's a fantastic show. Paul also talked about the Toronto Raptors, said Masai, who's the Raptors president, loves him. They could take him without even seeing him at 31. Workouts aren't everything for these teams. If the Toronto Raptors draft Bronny James at 31 without having worked him out, I would love to know the initial fan reaction in Toronto if that happens. Folks, it's lying season. The weeks leading up to the NBA draft are lying season. They're called that for a reason. It's the same in the NFL. Agents are gassing up their players. Coaches and GMs are feeding, maybe not false, but misleading. They're driving narratives by feeding specific information to reporters. Like, this is the time of year where this kind of stuff happens. But it is wild, not surprising considering the family connection, of course, but it is wild that these are the quotes that we're getting for a player of Bronny's caliber. I really do want Bronny James to succeed. Sincerely, I do. I think coming back from a cardiac arrest and a poor season at USC and becoming his own man and having success in the NBA is a fun and powerful story. Sons of NBA legends traditionally do not do well. Jordan's kids didn't do much. Pippen's kid is struggling to stay in the NBA. Shaq's kid didn't stick in the NBA. It is hard to make it in the NBA as the son of a superstar Hall of Famer, one of the greatest of all time. I would love to see Bronny buck that trend, but the narrative and the media, the sensationalism that has followed him, I think is going to make that path even more difficult. And I also recognize that I am currently contributing to that. So, I have to reckon with that myself, but it has certainly been quite a whirlwind, and I'm very curious, anxious, excited to see what ends up happening on draft day next week. Want to move on from Bronny James to talk about a pair of other undersized point guards who are in this draft class, who I think are not getting as much attention as they should, and who I believe will make whatever teams draft them very, very happy. And we're going to talk about those two guys in just a second. Right after I tell you all about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you are into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or folks, you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Eddie Patton, still locked on college basketball, and we're still talking guard prospects next week's NBA draft. But instead of talking Bronny James, I'm going to talk about two other veteran point guards who are in this draft class, who have done well at workouts, did well at the combine, had successful college careers, who I just feel like are not getting a lot of attention from NBA draft analysts, from scouts, and I think are guys who either will go higher in the draft than many people are projecting them, because again, the people who make mock drafts and the people who analyze the draft are not the same people who actually, are general managers and make those picks. And these two guys are gamers and winners and all those kind of intangible things that I think is going to drive attention for NBA scouts, or they're guys who may actually fall in the draft and are going to outperform the expectations depending on where they get picked. The two players we're going to talk about here are Houston point guard Jamal Shead and Colorado point guard KJ Simpson. A lot of similarities, not just the fact that both of them measured exactly 6'0.25" without shoes, although that is a true reality of both of these players. But I think they're different players stylistically, but they're undersized point guards who are, a lot of people focus too much on that. He's 6 foot, he's too small, he's not going to make it. And it is a reality that the NBA is skewing more and more towards bigger guards, jumbo guards. You want your point guards to be 6'3" plus, your combo guards to be, or your two guards to be 6'5" plus, and anybody under that is kind of considered more of an anomaly now. CJ McCollum at 6'3" is like a super small shooting guard, whereas in previous eras of the NBA, 6'3" was pretty normal for a shooting guard. It's changing, and I think teams are really starting to heavily prioritize size and length over maybe some of the other intangibles. Let's start with Shead. Most places have him as a mid to late second round pick. CBS does have him 34th. That's kind of the highest that I saw him amongst like the general, national draft rankings, big boards, etc. But a lot of places have him like 50, 60, 45 maybe at the best. But this is a guy who's a 4-year player at Houston, twice was an all AAC performer. Last year, he was the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year and the Big 12 Player of the Year, just the straight up best player in the best conference in college basketball. Averaged 13 points, 6.3 assists, 3.7 boards, and 2.2 steals per game. One of the big issues for Shead is the outside shooting. And that's a reasonable concern. He's an undersized point guard who doesn't demonstrate consistent three-point shooting. That sentence alone significantly caps his upside as an NBA player. And I think that's reasonable, and I think that's fair. I'm not advocating for Jamal Shead as a top 10 pick or even a top 20 pick, and those are part of the reasons why. He shot about 31% from three last year. His career number is about 29.6. So that's about where he has been consistently in his career. Like I said, 6'0.25". He does have a 6'3" wingspan. He also has a 37.5-inch vertical. That is fantastic, and really kind of helps mitigate some of those concerns about his height. If you have a longer wingspan and a big vertical leap, that's going to help quite a bit. He also is one of the fastest players in this entire draft class. His three-quarter court sprint time was the second fastest among every player in the NBA draft combine, the fastest being Devin Carter from Providence, who is getting a ton of love for his athleticism. Now, Carter's much bigger than Jamal Shead, which helps, but Jamal Shead is a guy who's an elite passer. He is an elite defensive player. He's tough. He's physical. He gets in your face. He uses that length. He uses that vertical movement, all of that to be a fantastic defensive player. And I just don't see how that doesn't translate. I don't see Jamal Shead as like the starting point guard on an NBA championship team. I'm not sure I see Jamal Shead as a consistent starting point guard in the NBA. But I can't imagine he doesn't have like a 6, 8, 10-year career as a backup point guard who plays good defense, who can start for you in a pinch, and who is just beloved by coaches, beloved by his teammates, a pest for opposing teams. Like, it just feels like he's kind of, as much as a lock can be in a draft class like this, it feels like he's pretty close to being a lock in terms of a guy who can contribute day in and day out for an NBA team. And he's not getting a lot of attention for that in a class where there are a lot of riskier players that are going to go get drafted ahead of him. Let's put it that way. And a lot of what was said about Shead can apply to KJ Simpson. 3-year guy at Colorado, twice was all Pac-12 all freshman his first year as well. Averaged just under 20 points a game last year, about 6 boards and about 5 assists, as well as 1.5 steals. Simpson, unlike Shead, great shooter. 43.5% from three last year. He had never been remotely close to that good previously, though, and that is going to hold him back. Career 35% shooter. The year prior, he was like 29, and then this last year, he was 43.5. It is going to be held against him that he hasn't shown that consistency as an outside shooter for the majority of his college basketball career. But Simpson, also 6'0.25", but his wingspan is even bigger than Shead, 6'4.5", and his max vertical was 40.5 inches, one of the best marks at the combine. KJ Simpson is an elite athlete. He is long. He can jump out of a gym. His lane agility was the best at the combine, 10.49 seconds, the fastest time at the combine. He is an incredible side-to-side mover. He has a lot of length for a player of his size. The fact that he's 6 foot without shoes is borderline irrelevant to me when you factor in the 6'4" wingspan, the 40-inch vertical leap, and the fact that he's one of the quickest movers in terms of lane agility in the entire class. That wipes out the concerns of his size, in my opinion. Colorado guys have had success moving on. Simpson took on a huge role on a team with NBA talent. Cody Williams is going to get drafted. Tristan Da Silva is going to get drafted. They're probably both going to get drafted before KJ Simpson, yet Simpson's the guy who hung 20 as an average throughout the season. Again, like Shead, in different roles, but I have a hard time imagining Simpson not making it as a backup point guard at the next level. I'm not saying you draft him 20 or 15 or even 25. But in the early second round, reminds me a little bit of Andrew Nembhard, first pick of the second round a couple years ago. Look what he just did in the Eastern Conference Finals. He was fantastic. Different players, but again, veteran point guards are getting overlooked in the NBA draft, and I think we're seeing a lot of those guys have instant success in the NBA. I think Shead and Simpson are two guys who are going to thrive in the NBA and make some teams who passed up on them look a little silly. Well, folks, undersized guards are not the only guys getting overlooked in this draft class. We got a pair of mid-major bigs to discuss to close out the show coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and we are still talking NBA draft sleepers. As of when you're listening to this, it's Thursday or it's Friday. The draft starts on Wednesday. The first round of the NBA draft will be on Wednesday. The second round will be on Thursday. Why they switched that up, I have no idea. I have some idea. TV dollars and money, I get it, but it seems very silly. The draft is not a long process. It's not the same as the NFL draft. Whatever, regardless, the draft will be over 2 days next week. Talking about some guys who are not projected as high in this draft class as somebody who watched a lot of college basketball thinks that they should be. We talked about Jamal, Shead, and KJ Simpson, two guards who are getting unfairly knocked for their size and their age in this draft class. Now I want to talk about two bigs who are just not that well known because they didn't go to high major programs. I initially had planned to talk about Deron Holmes, but Deron Holmes, who went to Dayton, is now just recently, we found out, got an invitation to the green room. You can't really be a sleeper in a draft class if you're getting invited to the green room. It means the only people who get invites to the green room are like guys that are expecting to go in the top 20 potential lottery picks. We're seeing Deron Holmes mocked as high as the top 10. Oklahoma City at 12 feels like a lock to draft him if he falls that far. Deron Holmes, fantastic player. If you heard me teasing that we're going to talk about undersized bigs, I wanted to let you know Deron Holmes is not on that list because he's not a sleeper. He is being correctly valued as one of the best big men in this class. But there are a couple other bigs who are projected in the second round or potentially even undrafted who I want to talk about here. We'll start with Jonathan Mogbo. Jonathan Mogbo played last year at San Francisco in the WCC. He was the WCC Newcomer of the Year over Graham Ike, over Ryan Nembhard, both at Gonzaga. A bit controversial. As somebody who covers Gonzaga, I know how the fan base reacted to Jonathan Mogbo winning that award over those two guys, but he was tremendous last year for San Francisco. Transfer from Missouri State. When San Francisco brought in their transfer portal class, they had Mike Sheriff-Johns from Dayton, they had Malik Thomas from USC, they had Jonathan Mogbo from Missouri State. People were not talking about Jonathan Mogbo. He averaged 8.7 boards at Missouri State, but everybody was talking about Malik Thomas coming down from USC. Everybody was talking about Mike Sheriff-Johns, former top 100 prospect who was fine but not great at Dayton. And now Mogbo was San Francisco's best player last year, clearly. Averaged 14 points and 10 boards a game, 3.5 assists, about 1.5 steals per game, 64% on two-pointers, was highly efficient around the rim, highly efficient with a little bit of a jump shot, not a huge jump shooter, mid-range guy, which is something that he could stand to improve upon. But one of the things that is really desirable about Jonathan Mogbo's skill set is he can be kind of a connecting big, the way that Nikola Jokic is in the NBA, the way that Domantas Sabonis is in the NBA. Not as good as those guys, but that skill set of being able to get the ball away from the rim, find cutters, make good reads, and kind of, connect the offense. That's why it's called that, a connective big. Mogbo is also tested extremely well at the combine. He's 6', 6.25 without shoes, but he has a 7'2" wingspan. He also has a max vertical of 37.5. This dude is a high-level athlete. He is explosive. He's a fantastic rebounder. He had one of the best assist rates in the country for a player of his size at his position. These are all highly coveted skills. Bouncy rim running type bigs who can also step out and distribute the basketball are super valuable. Teams will want to feel confident about Mogbo's ability to space the floor, which is not an area that he has a lot of strength right now. And that will and should deter his draft stock. If you felt confident that he could be a 37 to 40% three-point shooter, he's going in the first round, lock it down. But you don't feel that about him right now. But if a team is willing to gamble that, hey, maybe that shot shows up, he could be a big-time steal in this draft class. He's started to get some more buzz. He's started to rise recently, and I think that'll continue to happen even over the last week before we get to the draft. I wouldn't be surprised to see him go a lot sooner than many people have had him on their mock drafts throughout this draft process. And I wouldn't be surprised if the team that takes him a little earlier is quite happy that they did 3, 5, 7 years from now. Last guy I want to talk about is Enrique Freeman from Akron. Enrique Freeman has a fun story. He went from the Portsmouth Invitational, which is kind of the, for lack of a better word, least impactful of the kind of post-season NBA draft tryout situations. Portsmouth's a little bit different than that. It's pretty much exclusively for seniors, for guys who are not even considering returning to school. It's often guys who have very decorated college careers at mid-major programs, or guys who just really don't. You rarely see players on that list who are like, oh, that guy's going to be an NBA player. But Enrique Freeman dominated at Portsmouth and then got an invite to the NBA G League Combine, where you see more NBA players, but it's mostly guys who are undrafted, two-way type players, unlikely to actually get picked. And then from that, Freeman also got invited to the NBA Draft Combine. He went from the Portsmouth Invitational to the G League Combine to the NBA Draft Combine. Very few guys do that. And he did it because teams started to figure out, oh, this guy's an incredible athlete, an extremely good basketball player, an elite rebounder. He was a dominant force at Akron. He spent 5 years there. Last season, his final year with the Zips, 18.5 points a game, 13 rebounds, 1.7 blocks, and 1.7 assists. He also shot 37% from three. Now, granted, that was on 1.5 3-point attempts per game. So you got to take that with a significant grain of salt. But I'd rather have a guy who shot 37% on 1.5 attempts per game than a guy who shot 32 or 28. The fact that he shot 37%, even on a small volume, is an indication that that shot is there. You feel more confident about his ability to grow as an outside shooter than some of the other guys who didn't shoot at that percentage. He was the MAC player of the year. He was a 3-time All-MAC player. And coming into the combine, he measured at 6'7.25", so exactly 1 inch taller than Mogbo, with the same 7'2" wingspan. He also has a 35-inch vertical leap, a little lower than Mogbo's, but still very solid, a 9-foot standing reach, and was such a productive rebounder at the collegiate level. Yes, people will knock him for being a 5-year guy in the MAC, for playing at Akron. Can he average 13 rebounds a game even at a high major program? Probably not. Is he going to average 13 in the NBA? Of course not. Very few guys do that. But he is a great rebounder. And you watch him at the combine, you watch him in college, in workouts. Didn't see the workouts, but I have a feeling showed up there. He's got great size, he's got great length, and he's a developing shot blocker. He is a guy that is your prototypical backup center, rim runner, sets good screens, gets to the basket, can score over guys, has the verticality, has the strength to get to the free throw line. You're not confident in the outside shot necessarily, but it could be there developmentally. Reminds me a little bit of Brandon Clark. Now, Brandon Clark was 6'8" with a 6'8" wingspan, whereas Enrique Freeman has a much bigger wingspan, and I think could be that could help him be similarly impactful in the NBA as Brandon Clark. If you get somebody like Brandon Clark, even if they're not quite as good as him, they don't put up 10 and 5 like Clark has done pretty consistently in his career. If you can get somebody who is that same archetype in the late second as a two-way guy, that's where Enrique Freeman's being projected right now. That is a tremendous steal. And I think him and Mogbo both have those abilities. Mobo's more of a connective big. Freeman doesn't necessarily have that skill set. But is potentially a better outside shooter as well. So both these guys are guys who I think have NBA careers. And in this draft class, if you're in the second round, all you're looking for is a guy who's going to stick. These two guys, they're going to stick. I feel very confident about that. I really am curious to see if NBA scouts and analysts are going to maybe buck that trend and take these guys a little bit higher than a lot of the mock drafts are projecting. Or if not, if those guys will then kind of prove them wrong and prove me right, we'll see, and have these successful careers. I'm looking forward to coming back to this and seeing how these guys do, because I think there's a real chance that these four guys can have significant NBA careers and are not really being projected as such, at least not right now. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Isaac and I will be back on Friday, keeping you up to date and getting you ready for the weekend. We'll talk about the potential NCAA tournament expansion. And then as we get into next week, we got a fun guest lined up for early in the week. And then it's draft content, baby. We're talking about the NBA draft, talking about where these guys are going to go, where they end up, what it might mean. And then we'll get further into the offseason and start doing some team previews, all that good stuff coming your way here on Locked On College Basketball. Thanks again for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. And until next time, as always, peace out.